In 1965, Singapore was one of the poorest nations in the world. 3 decades later, it became a developed country with its own military, industries, and government institutions that became models for other developed and developing nations worldwide. What makes it unique is that all this happened in one generation, making it an economic miracle. This is the story of Singapore. The story of modern Singapore starts in 1819 when Sir Stamford Raffles founded a settlement at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. At the time, the British were looking to expand their trading empire to the Dutch-dominated trade in the Malay archipelago. Looking for a place that was not claimed by other colonial powers and that lay on the trade route, Raffles found Singapore an ideal place due to its natural deep harbor, the abundance of fresh water, and timber for supplying and repairing ships. At its founding, there were around 1,000 people living on the island. A census held in 1824 shows this number grew to more than 10,000 people. The port soon prospered due to the influx of trade caused by the free port status of the island. Many Arab, Chinese, and Asian traders flocked to Singapore, trying to avoid the heavy trade restrictions and taxes imposed by the Dutch. In 1819, $400,000 worth of trade passed through Singapore. Merely 4 years after the founding of the island, this number grew to $22 million, surpassing the long-established port of Penang, which served as the main British port in the Malay Peninsula until then. In 1824, the Treaty of London was signed between Great Britain and the Netherlands. It reaffirmed British settlements north of the Strait of Malacca. In exchange for British recognition of its colonies south of the Straits, the Dutch government also conceded all claims it had in the Indian subcontinent. The treaty led to the clear separation of British and Dutch spheres of influence in the region. As a result of the London Treaty, the Straits Settlement was established in 1826. The settlement included Penang, Malacca, Singapore, and Dinding. Later, Singapore became the seat of government for the Straits Settlements. The end of the First Opium War in 1842 and the subsequent Treaty of Nanking opened the Chinese market to European traders as the British Empire gained control of Hong Kong and gaining access to the Chinese market, further increasing the trade that passed through Singapore. Rule of the island was transferred to the British Crown in 1867. The growth of the port was accelerated even more by the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. Coupled with the rising use of steamships, the new route allowed European ships to travel to India faster, reducing the distance ships had to travel previously by half. Singapore became the gathering and distribution point for rubber and tin. The 1870s and 1880s saw large population growth leading to the expansion of settlements away from the port area towards the suburbs. By the end of the 19th century, the population had grown to more than 200,000 people, with the majority of them being Chinese. The rapid population growth led to poor sanitation and housing shortages, lowering living standards of the population. Incentivized by the large profits the mines and the production of rubber brought in, the British government decided to become more involved in the peninsula, leading to the formation of the Federated Malay States. Over time, the export of raw materials replaced a long-established trade of finished goods like porcelain, tea, fabrics, and weapons that previously dominated Singapore's markets. Rubber and tin ore made up 50% and 17.4% of the port's exports by the mid-1920s. Growing demand for these products during the First World War further increased trade at the port. Singapore was becoming a global trading hub, being affected by conditions in the global market. The port of Singapore had become the 7th largest port by volume in the world. The island had become more and more integrated with the hinterland Malaya, both economically and politically. The peninsula, which was made up of the federated and unfederated Malay states, was then known as British Malaya. The Johor-Singapore Causeway opened in 1924, facilitating easier access to the island. Singapore's trade rose from $11.6 million in 1824 to $1.8 billion in 1926. The First World War didn't have a negative impact on Singapore. However, the war greatly diminished the dominance of the British Empire in the region, eventually being replaced by the US and Japan. Despite the booming growth during the First World War, the city's economy took a downturn during the Great Depression, showing the port's dependence on the demands of the global market. The depression caused industrial production to drop by 41%, and foreign trade decreased by 71% in the United States alone, causing shockwaves throughout the global economy. The falling demand of commodities significantly affected the economy of Singapore, since 50% of the trade was with North America, in particular the US. Later, as the world economy recovered from the depression, so did Singapore. Until the start of the Second World War, the British defenses of the Malay Peninsula and that of Singapore were inadequate. Most of the defense structures of Singapore were planned to defend against a seaward attack. After the end of the First World War, the British had built a Sembawang naval base in Singapore. It was meant to serve as a base in the event of an attack on British colonies in the Far East. However, the fleet was never deployed when the time came. In December 1941, the Empire of Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Malaya simultaneously, launching the Pacific War. The main objective was capturing the resource-rich Southeast Asia. At the beginning of the war, most of the British forces were stationed in Singapore, leaving the defense of Malaya in the hands of an Indian regiment and volunteers from the Federated Malay States. Japanese forces, led by Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita, landed in the north of Malaya. The British naval commander, Admiral Tom Phillips, tried to stop the attack using the naval fleet, which was called Force D. The fleet included the newly built battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse and 4 destroyers. But having no air support, it was vulnerable to airborne attack. On December 10, the Japanese Air Forces attacked the fleet, sinking both capital ships. 840 sailors lost their lives. When British Prime Minister Winston Churchill heard of the incident, he remarked, "In all the war, I never received a more direct shock." As I turned over and twisted in bed, the full horror of the news sank in upon me. There were no British or American ships in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific, except the American survivors of Pearl Harbor, who were hastening back to California. Across this vast expanse of waters, Japan was supreme, and we everywhere were weak and naked. After the attack of Force C, the Japanese forces controlled the seas and air. Supported by tanks and superior equipment, the Japanese quickly advanced south, taking control of Kuala Lumpur by January 11, 1942, followed by Johor on January 27. It was at this moment the British government realized how untenable their position was, but it was too late. British defenses were not ready to repel an attack from the north, which added more confusion to the unorganized stance of the defenders. The Japanese assault started on February 11th and ended on February 14th with the fall of Singapore. What followed was the largest surrender of over 85,000 troops in British history, making it the most humiliating defeat of British forces during the Second World War. The defeat permanently eroded trust in British capability to defend its overseas interests and the well-being of citizens living in the colonies. Living conditions quickly deteriorated under Japanese occupation. Since the island depended on imported food, shortages occurred soon after the occupation started. In addition, businesses and property owners were forced to contribute to the war effort through donations. The Japanese treated the citizens of the island differently based on their ethnicity. The Chinese were treated worse than the others. Japanization of the society began soon after, which started from renaming the island to Sainan-tu. Resistance to the occupation was minimal in Singapore. The only opposition the Japanese forces faced was limited to the Malay jungles, which the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, the MAPJA, was the armed branch of the Malay Communist Party, MCP. It was composed of ethnic Chinese and Malays. Supply shortages led to the creation of a black market, and corruption grew astronomically in Singapore. Japanese occupation lasted until the war ended in 1945. In 1945, the Japanese army on the island formally surrendered on September 12th. The occupation deeply compromised the sense of security and trust Singaporeans had on the British administration, leading to questions of liberty and freedom soon after. On April 1st, 1946, the Straits Settlement was dissolved and Singapore became a crown colony once again.